I feel like we're very lucky today because we have three women who know the supply chain from a variety of different angles. So I think we're really going to get a broad perspective. Pooja looks at the supply chain from the point of view of an investor. Jennifer has a platform and she advises company on her supply chain. But I thought we'd start with you, since you actually run your own supply chain. I think the question I'd like to sort of start just to lay the table is, what are the big challenges? Obviously, this has been, I mean, supply chains have entered the public domain as something that regular people talk about ever since China and COVID. So when you look at this upcoming year, we have two issues. One is just what are the biggest issues for the supply chain? And then what do you see as the biggest issue when you talk about sustainability?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and thanks for having me here. So for those of you that may not be familiar with AB InBev, we are the world's leading brewer with operations across nearly 50 countries around the world. We are a global local company. So we do see the far-reaching implications of climate change across our entire value chain. And for us, the way we'd like to think of beer at ABI is beer is inclusive, natural, and local. Inclusivity comes from working with tens of thousands of smallholder farmers in the field side by side as a trusted partner, all the way downstream to millions of small retailers that we work with, mom and pop shops, and we work to close digital inclusion gaps, financial inclusion gaps, amongst those entrepreneurs. Natural, we work with nature instead of against it. We have a lot of raw materials in our products, so barley, hops, etc. So again, agriculture, water stewardship, these are key priorities for us. And last but not least, local, as I mentioned, with operations in nearly 50 countries. So for us, when we think about supply chain and the challenges, we'd like to think of our role as, how can we use our spheres of influence and how can we really bring our supply chain partners along with us on the journey towards decarbonization, towards creating that resilience. I think why you do what you do really matters. So, how we think about supply security and building that resilience on one hand, but at the same time coupling that with, the innovation angle. What does the future of agriculture look like? The future of packaging, the future of logistics. And we really feel that as we start asking these questions, it's very important that we bring others along with us on the journey. So I think this will be a key focus for us, again, going into next year.
But when you look at what were the challenges, like what would be the hardest thing, in terms of this year, in terms of what you faced, in terms of getting what you needed to your brewers, or was there any specific issue? Was it?
Because we are, almost all of our products are locally sourced, brewed, and enjoyed. So for us, we didn't see some of the big global supply chain disruptions that others may have seen. So we continue to invest locally in building that resilience, building local capacity. So I think, again, as I mentioned, building that capacity locally, bringing in the innovation, creating those collaborations within the supply chain will be really key for us to make huge advancements towards the future. Yeah.
Jennifer, how about you? You have a lot of different clients, and what were some of the big challenges they're facing right now? Not all of them are local. I'm assuming that there's a lot of lessons to be learned about a local supply chain. And what were the big challenges, and how does that relate to sustainability?
And thank you for having me as well. So Interos, for those of us that don't know, we map and monitor global supply chains. Right now, our AI platform monitors about 350 million businesses around the world. And we're monitoring not just for who's doing business with who and whether that's a good or a bad thing, but to your point, when the pandemic hit, we had a lot of organizations, a lot of customers concerned with, were there sub-tier suppliers? Did they have the financial wherewithal to keep going? Did they have the labor to keep going? And then when you think about here in the States, we had solar winds that occurred, so cyber breaches, sustainability and ESG. And I think what Ezgi just went through is really interesting, because whether it's a local supply chain or a global supply chain, I think one of the biggest challenges as well as opportunities is really the cultural shift that you just went through from a leadership standpoint, and really understanding that sustainability and ESG, why some people see this as a challenge because of the cost of doing it, saying it's the cost of doing business with, this is really the way to drive brand loyalty, whatever that's called right now, as well as profitability. And I think that from an ongoing standpoint, as you highlighted, Leslie, it's still rolling pandemics. It's still shortage of labor. It's still this recession that we're talking ourselves into. It's the restrictions. It's the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of geopolitical concern. For the first time ever in my 20-some-year career as a logistician, geopolitical risk outweighs just about everything else. But I think, the theme of this conference and the focus that we're talking about here, sustainability and ESG is really brand and reputation. And that can cost just as much as any other type of business interruption.
Okay. And how about you, Pooja, from an investor, someone who's looking at, especially clean energy, right, is where a lot of your focus is. Are supply chains something, I mean, I know I've read that you look a lot at the politics and how local politics are going to see how things are going to impact. Do you look at supply chain issues? Do you worry about, I don't know, critical minerals?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you for having me here. And just by way of background, Carlyle has about $370 billion of assets under management. And we truly are a global investment firm with investments in companies, assets, and then overall businesses across multiple different sectors. So when we think about supply chain, we actually have two different perspectives. Our first perspective is actually as an investor in these companies that operate across multiple sectors as well as multiple geographies. And what the pandemic highlighted was that just-in-time inventory may not be the most risk-mitigated way to operate your business. And then the pandemic, on top of that, you have to layer on the geopolitical complexities around the war in Ukraine, which has resulted in an escalation of commodity prices and a focus on supply chain security and energy security. So first of all, we actually deal with this just as owners or investors in these portfolio companies. So we have a front row seat to a lot of these issues that were just mentioned. And I do think that this issue is a lot more complex. At the end of the day, ESG or sustainability is at the heart of everything that we do at Carlyle. So we want our portfolio companies to focus on sustainability when they're thinking about their procurement practices, when they're thinking about their manufacturing practices, and then ultimately when they're thinking about getting their products and services to their end customers as well. So ESG is a very holistic view that we apply across all of our portfolio companies. Since you specifically asked me about energy transition, which is a focus of ours within our infrastructure business, I would say by far energy transition is one of our biggest growth areas within infrastructure. And that's not only because of climate change, but also because of energy security. I do think that energy transition is somewhat unique. We are beginning to see supply chain issues abate a little bit as the market is opening up quite a bit across all sectors except for energy transition. When you think about energy transition, a lot of the supply chain is localized in Southeast Asia. There are some significant concerns there around manufacturing practices. For example, there are some geopolitical tensions that are in place there, so you have to learn how to navigate around those issues. We believe we have the capabilities to do that because of our global presence as well as our strategic relationships. But I do think that that is an important focus. But even if you leave that aside, you are on a growth trajectory for energy transition that is somewhat unprecedented. And it just got accelerated even more because of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. Right. So you have a historically underinvested supply chain right now. And just like any commodity cycle, you need to invest in that supply chain so that it can keep up with demand. And that includes not only investing with manufacturers, but also further upstream, which goes back to your question around metals, minerals, rare earths. And that becomes an important focus as well.
So I do want to talk about the opportunities that are presented, but it occurred to me just in listening whether we might ask you to define what sustainability means to you, because it's such a broad topic, and for some people it might just mean making sure that the water and is used sustainably or the land is used sustainably, but it might also be about energy. You might have another problem. For instance, you might need minerals, which are mined, which are not good for the earth, but you're producing clean energy. So are there some things you put into sustainability? Is there anything you could knock out? How do you define it so it works for you?
Maybe I'll kick it off. Sustainability has many dimensions, environmental, social, economic. And increasingly what we're seeing is that you have to multi-solve. So you can't just tackle the environmental challenges. You can't just go and try to solve for economic challenges, but you have to look at it more holistically. And that's what the pandemic has also shown us, right? The materiality of environmental, social governance metrics within a business have become really important because now for the first time we understood the implications of environment on global health, on economy. I think it's quite broad, but most important is how you think about what makes sense for your business, I would say.
And you particularly, is there anything you can limit? Like, we're not going to look at that. That can't be part of sustainability. Do you put any limits on it?
I think sustainability is an area where you can't pick and choose, right? I think this is why materiality is so important, right? We have to really focus on what are the non-financial indicators that are material to your business and continue to tackle for that. And then there will always be topics that are more philanthropic focused or citizenship focused within the local communities. But as you think of sustainability, it needs to create that shared prosperity for the business as well as the communities and planet.
I mean, what do you advise your clients? They can't do it all,
Well, you can't, and I think you answered spot on. It has to address the value drivers of your organization. And I think as someone that owns your own supply chain, you're a bit at the crosshairs of what are the regulators telling me I need to take on? What are my consumers willing to continue to buy from me as long as I adhere to? And more is how can I attract the talent I need, because people are making decisions with their feet of who they go to work for based on the principles you stand on. And I mentioned to you before we came out here, I got called in to meet with the CEO of a major entertainment and media company, which is not core to our go-to-market strategy. Because if you think about supply chain, that's probably not where you go first. It wasn't where I went first. But increasingly, they were literally having mini protests by their employees because they weren't taking a stand on how water was being used or how they were investing in good earth and doing well by doing good. And I find that really very interesting. And so, yes, we don't have enough money, and the impact isn't as great for everything at the same time, but you do really have to balance on that brand reputation, which is both from a consumer standpoint, where brand loyalty, I think over the last 3 years has become very, very hard to keep, the regulators, and attracting the talent you need.
And how about you? How do you balance it as someone looking at a huge portfolio with a lot of different options? I mean, you need rare earth minerals, but, sometimes it's ugly how they get out there.
Well, and we have to balance the fact that our primary target is to generate our target returns. So we're very focused on commercial outcomes. Look, I'll say two things. The first one is that when it comes to managing supply chain issues, it is a partnership. It is a partnership with the CEOs of our portfolio companies. But more importantly, it's also a partnership with the different suppliers. We do a lot of procurement across our portfolio companies. That's actually one of the ways that we drive value creation within our portfolio companies. And I have to tell you, our suppliers are willing to lean in and work alongside with us. And that has been a very collaborative process. So we are making incremental progress working with these suppliers in terms of solving around some of these ESG metrics. The second thing I would say is we all have to apply a dose of practicality or reality to what we're doing here. And to give you a very simple example, in infrastructure investing, we focus a lot on the carbon intensity of the assets or the businesses that we invest in. You were asking for a metric, that's a metric that we focus on. Well, we always say that reducing the carbon intensity of these assets is a transition. It is not a revolution. You cannot just flip a switch and go zero emissions immediately. And I think the same philosophy applies to a certain extent, even with managing your supply chain.
Well, so we've come out of this very intense period. I'm not sure we've come out of it. We might still be in it for a while, but we seem to be in a period where, the Inflation Reduction Act has been passed. China seems to be loosening up. Supply chains seem to be a little. What are the opportunities, if you want to start maybe, what do you see as the opportunities in the coming year for making your supply chain more resilient and more sustainable?
Yeah, so that is kind of that second perspective I was talking about as an investment firm. Our first perspective is obviously as a business owner or investor. Our second perspective is that, look, wherever we see disruptions or, I would say like an imbalance, that is where we see opportunity. So for us, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity in terms of investing in the supply chain, especially around the energy transition. The passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, there has been a focus on onshoring manufacturing capacity.
Right.
We think that there's going to be a lot of opportunity around that. And that is one that we are very organized around right now. So that is the one place where we're seeing a lot of opportunity. Another place where we are seeing opportunity is really rolling up our sleeves and working with the management teams of our broader private equity business in terms of implementing some of these practices that Jennifer was talking about and really helping them think about their supply chain in a more holistic and sustainable business as well. So the first one I would say is an investment opportunity. And then the second one we think is value creation, which hopefully should lead to better exit multiples and valuations.
How about you? What are you telling, Jennifer? What are you telling your clients?
So I love that you went right for the fact that we have to make money, because at the end of the day, that's really what we need to have happen, no matter what solutions we're looking at. But I think there's 4 areas that are opportunities that we're seeing folks move to, and at Interos, we work on 2 of the 4. One is just the upskilling of labor. And that's a massive change, because a lot of folks are driving, as you're talking about the stress on the supply chain is being reduced, we've had 3 years to make some cultural shifts, leadership shifts, investment decisions, and you're seeing folks making those changes. That's what you're feeling. There's a new understanding. I mean, the conversations I'm having now with CEOs of world brands, I was not having 5 years ago. That's happened the last 3 years because our CEOs are realizing how closely the health of their supply chain and being able to fulfill orders and operational resilience is to their business bottom line. So the first thing is using data to inform where am I going to make those investment decisions, and a lot of that's the upskilling of labor throughout the supply chain. The second is what you just touched on from an infrastructure and a manufacturing. Look at the major announcements with TSMC that came out of Arizona yesterday. The onshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, whatever you want to call it. It's just alternative sources of supply, but massive investments in that. The third opportunity is really where we play as a home run, which is really the transparency of the supply chain, because I don't know where to invest. I don't know where to double down if I don't understand what my supply chain looks like. And then the last, and you also talked to this, is the partnership. There's a massive push to bring our supply chain closer, not in proximity, but from a working relationship. We started, my company, I started as the US federal government was my customer. And that's still really hard, that public-private partnership. But if you think about the supply chain of the government, any government is really the private sector, you're seeing more of that partnership. So that last opportunity, so you have the infrastructure manufacturing, you have the labor upskilling, you have the mapping and monitoring of the supply chain, so you understand if you're doing the right things and you're investing in the right places. And then the last is, how do I collaborate with my suppliers better? So when things do go bump in the night, when regulations change, when something gets interrupted, we can make decisions faster, which keeps costs down and allows us all to react at a better price and quicker.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you already have a very, as you say, localized but global localized supply chain. So that seems like a good place to be in this world, but what do you see as the opportunities and the things?
Yeah. I would definitely agree with Jennifer and Pooja around the need for upskilling or reskilling, the partnerships, the manufacturing side, and I would maybe bring it all together to say, for us, we have also gone through this realization about 6-7 years ago where we moved the sustainability function into our supply chain. So that's our operations and procurement teams, because we realized that that's where the greatest impact and risk is, and that's where we can continue to build these partnerships. And it's really changed the dynamics of how we engage with our suppliers, because now we started having more strategic, more longer-term conversations as opposed to just transactional discussions.
Can you give just one example of how that works?
Yeah. So. Putting the sustainability team and responsibilities within procurement and operations teams, right? So that cultural shift, as was mentioned, is so unique because now you're actually co-designing what sustainable innovation or what future commitments your company should be making. So we went through that around 2018 timeframe when we were coming out with our public commitments, our 2025 sustainability goals. And what that has enabled us to do was actually come out with a set of public commitments that were designed or co-designed by cross-functional teams. You know, not only the corporate affairs, legal, people teams, but also you know, procurement, supply chain, R&D.
So important.
So it's so unique and so important to be aligned internally. But what we're realizing now is because we've achieved that, now we also have to go and align externally as well. So how do we change that conversation, that dynamic? We created a platform called Eclipse. It's our supplier collaboration platform. Where we're convening some of the world's largest packaging and raw material suppliers, amongst others, to come together and to think through what will it take to get to that net zero or that lower carbon future? What are the hotspots or what are the key opportunities for us to tackle? How can we co-pilot? How can we co-innovate? This is a new way of thinking. It requires a mindset shift because we're all in this together, right? As we're building that future and the pathways towards that future. That's on one hand with the large suppliers, but we also in the process realize that we only still would have 85, 90% of the solutions that we're looking for. So we have to go and identify new innovative partners as well. So we launched our 100+ Accelerator program where we've accelerated, with the current cohort, we'll have accelerated over 100 startups that are actually working to close the gaps against our public commitments on agriculture, water, packaging, climate, inclusive growth, upcycling. So there's a lot within that space. But the way we do that, again, is not just the core sustainability team that goes and selects these startups. It's actually dozens of folks within the business, down to an energy and fluids director, an agronomist, a packaging specialist that will look into these startups, these solutions that are out there, the breakthrough thinking that's out there, and try to bring them in, pilot, and then look for ways to scale. So for me, the opportunity is, I think the world needs reasons to believe, and there are reasons to believe out there. So what are those startups, those breakthrough solutions? What are the powerful collaborations that are happening that can really accelerate change?
Yeah, I have to say, as a reporter who's been covering this for more years than I like to count, you often see goals be announced and come and go. I think there can be a fair amount of cynicism, which is not always productive, about the long-term integrity of those goals. So maybe we can talk about how to maintain momentum and long-term integrity, especially because corporations these days seem to reorganize themselves every 4.5 minutes. So it's very hard to keep a long-term path when it comes to this. Did you have any thoughts, Pooja?
Sure, I can kick it off. We think that tracking that data is just incredibly important. Auditing the data is incredibly important. But what we've also realized is there's a lack of consistency on how the data is calculated and reported. And also, we've noticed there's a lack of consistency in terms of the metrics that people look at. So unfortunately, this is not like GAAP accounting standards. There is no standardization. And that is why we took a leadership position at Carlyle and we led the ESG Data Convergence Project, where we partnered up with other GPs as well as LPs, and we agreed to a set of metrics. So obviously, we're in the early stages now of rolling out that program, but now the data is being aggregated, and we are tracking that data, and it is consistent across not only our portfolio companies, but also the portfolio companies of these other GPs and LPs who've signed up to that project. It is an extra layer of reporting for our portfolio companies. That is a consideration. Oftentimes, whether we're making control equity investments or structured equity investments, we have to wire that into our documents as well, so that management teams realize that that is data not only that has to be gathered, audited, and reported, but it's also performance data that they are held accountable to. So that is the second thing that we do here to make sure that we can maintain integrity in terms of what our reporting obligations are, and also that we are actually delivering what we intended to do when we made these investments as well. So that's just a very important part of that. The second thing I would say is that innovation is just a very important part to implementing sustainability across the supply chain. And we do believe that maintaining somewhat of a center of excellence where all of our portfolio companies can come to us and tap into our knowledge base can be some useful operating leverage that they can have access to.
That makes sense.
So you need to stay ahead of the curve even from an innovation perspective.
Absolutely. Now, we only have about 5 more minutes left. Abby, you had some questions you wanted from our audience?
Yes, we do have some submissions from the audience. The first one is related to the S in ESG of all of this, as in supplier diversity. What do you see as the major challenges of access and opportunity for minority and women-owned product/service providers?
Jennifer, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So I think, although I think Pooja may have a different thought, and actually you mentioned it as well, I think that where we see this is that there's only a certain amount of companies, there's a couple different answers depending on what sector you're trying to get a job in or provide a service or product to. There's only a certain amount of companies that do a certain amount of things. And so often you see certifications or trainings or things that can be inhibitors. The great part about it though, and I think if you go back to what Pooja just went through, is that the opposite of having clear goals and metrics on your ESG sustainability practices is actually large companies. And I talk about this a lot. Like, this is the world where small businesses win, because the opposite of being able to have the transparency of that supply chain is mergers and acquisition. And that's how the big guys get big. And so I think if I'm a small or medium-sized business, I'm going in and saying, you can trust me because I map and monitor, I have a sustainable practice, these are the things that I adhere to, I understand what you're asking me for, what you value, what you'll invest in, I can do X, Y, Z, and it becomes a very clean and easy conversation, and that provides alternative sourcing. So there's lots, again, depending on the industry, there's lots of things that can keep you from it. But I do think from an ESG sustainability, this is an area where the small, medium-sized businesses can win because they have the transparency to be able to prove it easier.
Okay, and we have another one related to blockchain technology and asking if this is an answer to many supply chain issues we face in terms of promoting ethical and sustainable sourcing.
Does anyone want to take that one?
Yeah, I can give an example. It's one solution within a toolkit, right? So we're actually implementing it across our supply chains in agricultural sourcing regions where we want to get closer to that farmer. We know that farmer, we work closely with them, but we also want to bring visibility to them in terms of how much we're buying from them, how much we're paying for what we're buying, et cetera. So it's not just a benefit for us, it's also a benefit for that ultimate small supplier. So that's really important. But what we're also trying to tackle for is, in many cases, these small suppliers don't seem to exist in our supply chain. So they're not very bankable, right? So how do they then create that record that they actually sell to us ultimately? To an AB InBev local company. So by tackling the transparency within our supply chain for reporting purposes or for innovation or supply security purposes, we're also tackling the challenges of that farmer so that they can go and they can get the loans, the crop insurance, et cetera, that they need. So yes, very useful tool and it has a lot of potential for sure. I don't know if you guys.
Yeah, I was going to say, can I just add one thing? I think that what you just went through is exactly right. It's one of the tools, and I think agriculture is the one that we go fastest to from a blockchain. It's a very point situation. And when you think about scope 1, 2, and 3 from a sustainability, I talk about a T all the time because it's the linear, it's the blockchain that can be solved, right? Because I know exactly that farmer where I'm sourcing from, but then it's everybody else in that ecosystem that I need to be thinking about. And that's really the defense in depth we need to be thinking as we're mapping out our ecosystems, because nobody can be sustainable by themselves. So I think blockchain does what you just said perfectly. But if you're really thinking about ESG and sustainability, it's a much broader, and it's a very dynamic conversation. Things change.